Good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar on managing impairment caused by drugs and alcohol. I'm Paul Wilkes, the FORS Business Services Manager, and I'm delighted to say that I'm joined today by David Whiffin from OdiliaClark, who I will hand over to in a minute. Now, as I'm sure many of you will be aware, this webinar is part of our monthly series where we introduce you to one of our associates who will share some of their knowledge and insight about best practice to help you run your fleets, as well as some of the offers and discounts that are available to you. So while I've got you here, I'll take this opportunity to remind you about our associates. FORS associates are companies who offer discounted products or services to FORS operators, and you can see here a list of all of the types of areas that they cover, everything from vehicle safety through to insurance and healthcare, and lots of others. And you can find these offers and discounts for our more than 150 FORS associates by going to the members dashboard and then click on Browse Products and Offers. And you can, as you can see there at the bottom right of the screen. And we've done a few of these webinars now. So if you have missed any of them or you want to watch them again, then you can find a link to all of our webinars on our Knowledge Hub page. And you can find that in the FORS webinar section of our training page on FORS Online. So very easy to find. So that's my bit done. So I just need to say that in the usual fashion, if you've got any questions during the presentation, then please use the question chat box on the right-hand side of your screen. And we will take some time at the end to answer any of your questions. So I'll now hand over to David to introduce himself and to take you through the main presentation. David, over to you.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me okay? I'm guessing that's a straighting. Yeah. First of all, then, I'm going to introduce the company, who we are, and give you some context as to how we've come about and what we do. First of all, we are members of the Drug and Alcohol Industry Testing Association, which is a US body, and the EWDTS, which is the European Workplace Drug Testing Society. And they define how we behave, how we test, and how we should behave within certain guidelines for testing. We are also main channel partners to Draeger Safety. So the equipment that we use is Draeger Safety equipment, or produced by Draeger, used by over 80 police forces globally. So it sets the standard really with regards to the equipment that's used in testing. There's a high chance that if your members of staff are pulled over by a police force or by an authority, that it will be Draeger equipment that is used on them. So before I get started, I think it would be remiss of me not to draw your attention to the FORS standard, what's included and what is required within the standard. So first of all, there should be a policy, and we're going to go into policy and what's covered in policy throughout this presentation, and it should include some form of testing. Again, we're going to talk about the testing and the different types of testing as we move through this presentation. So first of all, I want to answer for you the question, what is impairment? Or more importantly, I want to start to try and change the narrative of what has been seen as drugs and alcohol testing in general into more of a position of impairment management. Why is impairment important? Why do we talk about impairment? And what does impairment mean for your business? So I'm only going to touch on this very briefly, but I think to draw your attention to the Health and Safety at Work Act 1974, it only mentions impairment once, and it mentions impairment in the context of being disabled. So the idea of being able to check for a level of impairment within a workforce from drugs, prescription drugs, from alcohol, is starting to become a more commonplace feature, especially within the requirements we see from our clients. So what is impairment, or what is the context of impairment? Just before I jumped on the webinar, I did a quick Google search. I often do before we go to see clients, to have a look at what would be a pertinent piece of news to give you all. And the standout one that hit me was that 70% of drug deaths in Scotland in 2019 were related in some way or another to a benzodiazepine based substance, which is a prescription drug. A prescription drug that would be taken for anxiety and for sleep disorder and for mild pain. You would see that in people that sit down for long periods of time. They may be prescribed a light benzodiazepine for back pain. That was in 2019. So as we start to move through the presentation, and especially when we talk about the context of stress and maladapted coping strategies, I think it becomes more and more important that we start to consider the wider aspects of drug use within a workforce, within the working industry, rather than, I think, what jumps to most people's minds, and that would be maybe some hangover driving, maybe a bit of illegal drug use during the working day. Again, I want to also set I also want to set the scene around how this can happen within members of staff that work in your organization. I've specifically chosen not to use examples of drivers. Rather, I have used an example of a chap that we work with. You may have seen him on Radio 2 or in the newspaper. Nick was a police officer. He went to become a police officer, passed his tests to become a police officer, and on passing his tests, his cousin, who was also a serving police officer, gave him a line of cocaine to celebrate. Fast forward 5 years, Nick used cocaine then through training to help getting through. And a common theme that we see with cocaine users is that it does something for their personality that they can't necessarily do for himself. Add in the stress and the rigor of the job. Nick was let go from the police force on 4 to 5 grams of cocaine a day. It culminated in him assaulting a prisoner in the back of a van and being let go for the assault. None of his colleagues realized at the time that he was using substances in the way that he was using substances. One of the other examples I'd like to give you is Hayley. Hayley was responsible for the Coca-Cola integration, or the Costa Coffee integration into Coca-Cola when Costa was acquired by Coca-Cola. Hayley had been a social cocaine user for 23 years. By that, I mean on a Friday night or a Saturday night, she would have a line at the end of the week just to relax and to socialize. The problem came when Hayley's job became so stressful that the Friday afternoon or the Friday evening line at the end of the week became a Friday afternoon line to get her to the end of the week, that turned into a Wednesday lunchtime line to get her to the end of the week, that turned in a Monday morning line to start the week. Hayley's addiction culminated in Hayley collapsing at work with blood coming from her nose. She then used the excuse that she had a brain tumor. She was put into rehab by her employer, and she was on 3 grams of cocaine a day and 40 tramadol a week. So quite a significant problem there within the employee base. So what causes an employee like Hayley to go on to use a substance? And what we would do is we typically would talk about two main reasons. There's a lifestyle where it becomes where the substance use becomes a problem, either as a coping strategy or through illness. And then there is the night before user that we would also include the reckless type of user within the night before user, and that would be maybe someone who isn't properly educated in the risks of being impaired at work, or somebody who has a lower threshold to the risk that it may cause, which is why we need to deploy policy and procedure to try and prevent those people from being in the workplace. The more challenging one for businesses is certainly the lifestyle user that has potentially fallen on hard times, is using a substance as a maladapted coping strategy. So when I talk about maladapted coping strategies, I'm talking about things like fast food, gambling, surfing the internet, drugs or alcohol, whereas a positive coping strategy would be something like exercise, yoga, visiting friends, things that have a positive outcome on your life. Ultimately, regardless, or when I refer to a medication, again, with people that sit down for long periods of time, and as per my earlier slide, if they begin to use a drug, let's say for pain, then they start to develop a dependency on that drug. It's not that they are coming to work to use that substance, they are needing that substance as a part of their coping strategy. Ultimately, either way, the short-term impairments are the same, whether it's for the lifestyle user or the night before user. And that can be anything from an impaired judgment through to decreased spatial awareness type of challenges. The longer term consequences for the individual and for the business becomes a deeper dependence on the substance that they are taking, ultimately meaning that they need to take more and more of that substance to achieve the same effect, the same coping mechanism that it's giving them, and that leads to greater shorter term impacts, as in greater impairments. So the risk then starts to manifest within the business and within the employee. So we are a business that predominantly operate within the aviation sector as a main, and what I thought would be quite good is to lay out how some other industries are already dealing with this. Some of you this would be relevant for because you already operate in those industries and you may already be aware of those industries. So the aviation industry now have a very defined set of guidelines, as do the international maritime industries. I would then look to the oil and gas industry, and I would say they have the most prescriptive set of regulations, and the clients that we support in those industries have some quite tight levels in terms of drugs that we have to specifically look for and how we have to behave. And then as an outlier, I have the RSSB, the railway industry. I put them in a slightly different box because we have to use urine-based testing systems for the railway industry or for network rail-based clients. So for that reason, we generally don't dip into that industry. So one of the first things we have to consider when we are starting to consider bringing a policy on and rolling a policy out is the challenges and concerns of the staff, balancing that with the challenges and concerns of the organizations. So from the staff, what are the big ones that we engage with early? We have to engage with the unions early often to counter these challenges and make them understand that we are not to be used as a big stick. We are not to be used as a means of removal of an employee. I can honestly say there are easier ways to remove an employee from an organization rather than using us to try and deliver some testing for you. So that's probably one of the common misnomers that we hear. And then there is the level of concern around false negatives and false positives from the employee, in that they're going to be found doing something that they innocently haven't done. So again, that's going to be addressed as we work through. From you guys as operators, there is the cost. I would say the biggest challenge is not seeing the upfront cost of the testing, rather seeing the downside cost of if we find something and you have to stand an employee down, and that employee then we have to go back to the laboratory for results. The true cost is the cost of not having that employee at work for 2 to 5 days, depending on the systems that you're using. And naturally then there is the disruption element as well. What happens then if you are down a driver, particularly in this current climate where drivers are in shortage? And then finally that leads me into the so what element, and that is, what do we do if we find something? That was going to depend really on you as an organization. It will depend on your availability of funds and how you can cope. And for some smaller organizations, that's not going to be an easy solution. whereas we work with some larger clients where we even have rehab programs working where we can reintroduce the employee back into the workplace. So starting the journey, how do we start to look at putting a policy in? What are we going to do? How do we get the unions and the staff bought in? One of the most frequently laid down challenges to us is you're encroaching on our lifestyle, you're looking at what we do. My counter to that would be, if I'm climbing under a bus that somebody has jacked up, would you not want your members to be sure that they are climbing under a bus that a member of a sound state has jacked that bus up? So rather than looking at this being a punitive measure being placed on members of staff, it should be looked more as a protective measure to protect both the organisation, the customers, and the staff within that organisation. So the next couple of slides now, I'm going to start to talk you through this journey, how we get union buy-in, staff buy-in, what's involved in the policy, what training may or may not be required as we start to implement that into the organisation, and then what does testing look like. So first of all, and a big part of getting union buy-in, as I have said, is performing the right type of testing to show the right type of results. That is why I talk about impairment, and that's really why as an organisation we are focused on impairment management. So I mentioned at the start that the railway industry uses a urine-based testing system. We don't use urine, we don't go near urine, and we don't touch urine. Apart from the obvious undignified, it's open to being cheated, one of the biggest challenges is it doesn't show active compounds acting on the person at the point at which they have been consumed. We use oral fluid because it's as close to a blood test as we can get without actually extracting blood from the individual, from the donor. What does that mean? That means our window for detection is 2 minutes post-consumption, anywhere up to 24 hours at an absolute maximum. The counter to that with urine is the chances are you're not going to find a substance for potentially up to the first 2 days. So with cannabis, you wouldn't find a substance for the first 2 days post-consumption, but you would run a risk as an organisation then of finding something for up to 30 days. What that means is that you then go and find something in an employee. You would then have to stand that employee down whilst you go back to the laboratory to find out what the substance is, only to then be told it's a legacy metabolite, which we would know it's a legacy metabolite because you're looking for it in urine. And then you would reinstate that employee back to work. That employee could have taken that substance on holiday 3 weeks ago in Amsterdam where it was a perfectly legitimate substance. Alternatively, they could have taken a CBD-based oil that would for health reasons that they've bought from Holland and Barrett, that would then show a signature of having had a THC trace in it. Ultimately, you've got an employee now that you've had to stand down, you've got increased costs, and you've got increased disruption in your organisation. The only time that really changes for us is when we are testing new employees or employees that have been off with a longer term problem. And in that instance, we would use hair or fingernails. For that reason, we can see on average 3 to 6 months worth of history of substance misuse. So early on, union engagement, we talk more about we are looking for impairment. We're only looking for the substances acting on your staff at the point at which we are testing them. All of this is underpinned with a robust company policy. And if you don't have a robust company policy, you haven't communicated to an authority how you are performing your testing. You haven't communicated to your staff what is expected of your staff. You haven't defined what happens to your staff pre or post test, and you haven't set the limits that you will be testing for. So again, if you were to ever end up where you are being challenged on the testing that has been conducted, why it's been conducted and what it's been conducted for, then actually that element of your policy is the most important part that you do. And if I refer them back to the FORS regulations at the start, we are quite big on should and shall statements. So the FORS compliance says that you shall have a policy in place. That's because it defines to your employees what is expected of your employees at the point in time that they are working for you. The should element then relies to the testing, and that's because it leaves it up to you to do it in the way that is fit for your organization. Exactly the same as within the aviation industry. Moving on to the implementation. When we start to talk about implementations, we would typically look to hold an amnesty period. We would put some educational posters up around the organization with a view to this is coming in within a 2, 3, 4 week period. You've got time to come and talk to us, understand what's happening, and get some help. It is at that point that we would start to roll out the training with a view to the type of testing that is going to be happening. So what type of testing do we do? As I said, we do for cause or post incident. Quite often that will be taken out of our hands by an authority, potentially by a police force or by a regulatory body. Sometimes if it's a warehouseman in a warehouse and there's been an accident, then we might get called in to do a post-incident or a post-accident test. Random testing is exactly as it says. We will often, for our clients, select the employees to be randomly tested. We will just ask for a list of payroll numbers. We will select from payroll. We don't want employees' names. We don't want to hold GDPR information. Pre-employment testing. The only time that we would generally use a hair or fingernail test, with the exception of maybe the post-rehab or return to works. They tend to vary depending on the message that we're trying to send the employee. And then finally, there is a vehicle monitoring system that we have. For those of you that are familiar with it, it's called an Interlock System. It's wired into the ignition system of a vehicle. We can set it to predetermined alcohol levels, and we can set it to predetermined brake levels, so that if you have a multi-drop driver, then the multi-drop driver doesn't have to keep blowing into the device every time that they stop. Testing, post-testing, and when we are performing testing, all we or any other point of care testing company can tell you is that there is the presence of a parent drug only. So by that I mean the opioid would be the parent drug. Underneath that we would see codeine, cocodamol, heroin, and it could be any one of a range of drugs. We also can't tell you how much drug we have found within the person's sample once we have tested them. So for that reason, what we have to do is we have to take a couple of samples, we send them off to the lab, and any action that would be taken by an employer would be based on the results that we get from a laboratory, not on the results that we see from the point of care screening. All of that is done under a chain of custody conditions, which is the way that we manage and protect evidence as we move evidence to a laboratory from our place of work. And typically it takes us 3 days. I would say 95% of the time we're doing it in 2 days, but we would say within 3 days you will get a set of results back on exactly what is in that employee's system. Not all tests are made equal. So recently, as recently as April this year, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration in the US tested the top 5 pieces of equipment available on the market for drug testing. I'm only listing our 2 here, and the figures that are particularly interesting to us are the PPVs and the NPVs. So the PPVs are the positive predictive values, and the NPVs are the negative predictive values. That tells me the amount of times that the equipment gives me a reading. The sample is then sent back to the laboratory, and the laboratory results match up to the reading that the equipment has seen at the point of care test. For you guys, this doesn't really matter. What does matter is the level of accuracy that we deliver testing to within your organization, and the amount of stand down time that you're not going to experience in having employees taken out when there is nothing in their system, or even more importantly, the rate of false negatives that would be seen when compared to some of the others. And ultimately, we're always going to get false negatives and we're always going to get false positives for the way the equipment works. What we have to try and do is limit the amount that we actually see. That directly correlates to cost to you guys as operators, because that means you are potentially standing people down, or even worse, you are missing an employee that has a substance within them that gets missed by the testing and then goes and takes a vehicle out to work. Why is it important, and why does it happen? Underneath, you can see what is a screenshot of a data sheet from a piece of testing equipment from a large laboratory. The large laboratories, if you think back to where I talked you through oral fluid testing, the large laboratories have cottoned on to oral fluid being a true test of impairment. What they've done is they have re-engineered urine-based testing equipment to now look for oral fluid-based samples. The difference is that we are looking for different compounds or different metabolites. So if you look at the box in red, I hope you can see it on the screen, that is the equation for the secondary metabolite of tetrahydrocannabinol oil, cannabis essentially, and that the arrows tell me that it's looking for cannabis or that equation down to 25 nanograms. The problem is that that piece of equipment testing oral fluid is never going to find cannabis at that level, because that is what we are looking for within a urine-based sample. It's not until you flip the back of the data sheet over and it tells me that we are looking for delta 9 THC, if you follow the blue arrow across, delta 9 THC at 10,000 nanograms. You don't need to test an employee at 10,000 nanograms. They won't be able to stand up. To give you an idea, a typical cannabis cigarette can range anywhere between 50 to 300 nanograms. And I tentatively say 300 because there are THC rubs that you can get that you would rub on your cannabis cigarette to make it stronger. That is why equipment selection is really important when we're doing this stuff. So that's a very quick run through on testing, but before we even get to testing, I think a big part of what we do is based around organizational culture, organizational education, and how you prevent staff from getting to that point in the first place. Everything I've just discussed should be considered as the catch net for preventing employees that have slipped through a level of organizational support that's in place, whether that be a peer support network, whether that be an EAP, whether that be a program of care for that employee that ultimately prevents them getting to us in the first place. Some of you may now start to be aware that ISO 45003 is starting to come into prominence around how employees are psychologically supported and stress management is managed throughout the organization. So again, for me, it's very much about setting culture right at the starting point. To do that, we work quite closely with a partner organization where we can do everything from peer support programs right through to the self-reporting of staff. And this is where we start to encourage staff to self-report. If we have staff self-reporting, then we can put programs in place where we prevent them from using a substance to get there in the first instance, rather than it manifesting and becoming a problem that we can't deal with at a point in time. And what does that mean? That means everything from basic level substance counselling, once we found it beforehand where they make a self-referral, through to a level of rehabilitation. And we're not a rehabilitation company, and we don't aspire to be a rehabilitation company. What we do is we sit in that grey level where they are still useful employees, they can still be useful employees, but you as employers have lost confidence in that employee, in their ability to be coming to work. So whether that's something as basic as some counselling, or even we have some quite clever equipment where we can do some monitoring programs from a distance. So I would take an example like Peugeot Citroën, if they have an employee declare a problem, then a program is put in place to help that employee get over their issues while still becoming a valuable employee. The whole program is designed to be cheaper than going out recruiting and finding a new member of staff. So that's really the so what element, if we get them before the police gets them or if they declare to themselves. And I'm starting to come to the end now, so I'd just like to wrap up and say one of the big things I think is we've all been through the toughest 18 months that probably any of us have ever experienced. In the light of the last 18 months, what do I expect to see? Cocaine use is quite significantly down. However, as I said, benzodiazepines are typically prescribed for anxiety and sleeping disorders, and they are, I'll probably get in trouble for this, but they are a very quick way of doing some lazy doctoring. So if you get a call as a GP about somebody who's not feeling particularly great at the moment, it's quite an easy get out of jail to prescribe some benzodiazepine based substance to help them get through the period. And I think that's a legitimate method. The problem is that we are now knocking on the door of 18 months of what we've all been through. And at the very start, if you saw my slides, then really 6 weeks should be the limit that people are continually taking these substances for. And on that note, that is me handing back over for questions and answers. I hope it's been interesting for you, and I'm ready for questions.
Thanks, David. That was a really interesting presentation. Hopefully everyone got some good information from that. We do have a few questions to kick off, but just a reminder whilst I start to go through them that if you do have any questions, please use the chat or the questions section, and then we'll address those as we go through. A couple first that I can pick up. Can we share the slides later? Yes, we will share the slides, and we'll also make the webinar available to everybody in the section I showed you earlier as well, as we publish all these webinars. And also, is there any intention for FORS to require drug and alcohol testing as a mandatory requirement? And as David mentioned earlier, yes, it's at the moment it's a should rather than a shall, so it's your choice as to whether or not you want to implement a testing regime. You have to have a policy in place. We've discussed many times whether or not to make it a mandatory requirement, but we've generally felt that it's better to give the industry the choice, our members the choice as to whether or not they want to do that, as some are in different stages to others, to be able to do the testing in different ways. So we've left it at that at the moment. We do review the standard every 2 years, so that is something that we're monitoring and watching. So it's a should at the moment, but that may change in future years. We will have to wait and see on that. Okay, so some questions for David. How do you identify users among us? I think we've kind of covered some of those, but what's probably the best? What would be the best way?
Well, if I look to the start, and I get asked this question a lot. We teach this on our courses, dare I say, and I would say the number one way is probably employees asking for a raise. So when we talk about addictions and when we talk about maladaptive coping strategies, often one of the biggest challenges is the resources needed to be able to conduct the behavior. So that when I talk about resource, we break resources into two. There's the time. So if your maladaptive coping strategy is surfing the internet, ultimately you are wasting hours and hours a day looking at whatever rubbish that you're looking at on the internet. The alternative is, or consuming your substance. If you're on 5 grams of cocaine a day, typically a gram of cocaine is 6 to 8 lines, depending on how heavy you're consuming. If you think you've got to empty a little bit out, you've got to chop a little bit up, you've got to prep something to snort it through, snort it up, clear up, and then go and conduct your day. If you're doing that 5 lots of 6 times in a day, that's going to consume quite a lot of your time. Equally, the other resource then is money. So where do you see that as an organization? You might see absence, but the chances are they're probably going to be coming and asking you for, I need this month's money early because of. Again, when I talked to Nick, the police officer I talked to at the front end, he survived for 5 years in a police environment, snorting cocaine at work, and colleagues didn't notice. So to think that you're going to get trained to be able to spot substance misuse, not really going to happen. We have one client. We've been called into the same employee 3 times. Twice because he was drinking a clear liquid from a plastic bottle in work that they suspected to be alcohol. This story is relevant because it very much highlights the importance of policy. When we drafted the policy, we suggested that you don't put the national drink drive limit or the UK drink drive limit into the policy. For a couple of reasons. One, it doesn't give you any margin for error if they are close to the limit and then you're letting them go out onto the road. Two, because the limit is actually very, very high. There's quite a lot of research done. True impairment starts at 8 micrograms of alcohol. So our limit as a country, one of the highest in the world, is 35 micrograms of alcohol. Actually, that gives you quite a level of risk exposure as an organization to having an employee out there working. The third time we were called in to test that employee, it took us 45 minutes to get there to test him. He was at 126 micrograms of alcohol, and our tester that's been testing for about 20 years genuinely said he didn't know that he was under the limit until he got up to try and walk away, and then he noticed. But again, their levels, they're really good at starting to maintain a behavior, and that's one of the concerns.
Okay, thank you. How does it work if someone is on prescription medication such as methadone?
Again, if they're on methadone, I'd be surprised if they're doing a safety critical job. Interestingly, sorry to give you another story, we have a client that has a problem with a newsagent that sells methadone over the counter, along with clean urine, for some more interesting facts, dare I say. With prescription meds, again, when a test is being performed, we would, if we find a substance, and only when we found the substance, we would then do a drug declaration. So in a drug declaration, that's when they get the chance to tell us what substances, what drugs they are taking, prescription drugs. When the samples are taken to go back to the laboratory, so the way that we work in line with European guidelines is we take 2 samples. Both samples go back to the laboratory. One sample is tested and we get a certificate against that sample. The other sample is stored for 3 months should an independent test need to be conducted on that sample. The reason it's for 3 months is if you take action as an employee and remove that employee from the results of the test, then they have 3 months to bring tribunal against you as an organization. That's why we store our samples for 3 months. Hopefully that's the answer.
Yep, and you talked about CBD oil earlier being present in urine testing. Would it not also show up in oral testing, in the oral fluids?
Yes, it would. Problem with CBD, so there's a couple of problems with CBD oil, or there's a couple of problems. You hit on something that I could talk about for a long time, and that's masking agents. So what we see is, and this relates to the question I just had on prescription drugs, when we find a drug, the next thing we do is we do a drug declaration before we do anything else. What would you like to tell us you've taken? And sometimes they pull out their prescription and we write down all the details of the prescription. Sometimes it's as obscure as polo mints, paracetamol, and a bit of mouthwash. Ultimately, we don't really care. We write it on the list. When it goes back to the laboratory know what they're looking for. A masking agent would be a substance they tell us that hides the true nature of the substance. So Sudafed is a masking agent for methamphetamine. Benylin is a masking agent for amphetamine, or it would show as amphetamine. THC is the only one you could really use is CBD oil, and that's because the CBD oil market is unregulated. When they grow the hemp that they make CBD oil out of, then the mixture of seeds in there, if there is THC cannabis-based seeds in there, there is a chance, and with the detection levels that we have for cannabis, there is a good chance that if they've recently taken CBD oil for a legitimate reason, health reason, sport reason, we would then find that cannabis within that sample. Again, once it's gone back to the lab, we can then disprove whether it is or is not cannabis.
Okay, thank you. And I think it was a just get my to work as a follow-up on the earlier question about the methadone as a prescription. Are they allowed to work if they're covered by a prescription from a doctor?
Again, I would then say, what does the policy say? So we don't behave outside of a company policy. So first of all, what does the company policy say? I would say for that, it partly depends on the role that they are performing. If they're on methadone, I'm going to take a fairly heavy stab and say they've probably had at some point a heroin problem. If they have had a heroin problem, the chances are there is probably a deeper psychological history there that suggests that they are probably not going to be, they're probably not going to be flying an aircraft, driving a train. And I'm not suggesting that those people can't be rehabilitated, but I would suggest that would come after the methadone usage stage. So if they are using methadone, I would have thought that they should likely be in a what we would call a non-safety sensitive role. So it's hard to answer that question without saying they should never have another job. That's not at all what I'm suggesting. What I'm suggesting is we have to, on balance of risk, understand why they're taking methadone.
Yeah, so not driving a truck, they're saying. Yeah. Probably
I'd
not.
be surprised if they were. I was going to say I can't sit here and categorically say no, but the answer really is no.
You'd probably need to risk assess that, wouldn't you? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, a couple more questions. What's the problem with benzodiaz, whatever it is?
Benzodiazepine. Yeah.
Yeah, that's it. Where is it on the testing spectrum, and what's the allowed limits for it?
What if you're suggesting what are the allowed limits? There are. So if you look at what the police test for, the British police, if we stay in Britain, the British police only test for cocaine and cannabis at the moment. So really there are limits on that 0.2 nanogram or 2 nanograms on cannabis, and I think it's 2 nanograms on cocaine. I can't be certain. So there isn't, if we're talking in legality, there is no limit on a benzodiazepine based substance. So when we are writing a policy, we would generally write a policy based on our limits of detection. So that is what can we find on the basis of the limits that we find. If you look at the European Workplace Drug Testing Society guidelines, they allow laboratories to perform 2 tests, a screening test and a confirmatory test. The confirmatory test lays down the limits that should be found for a benzodiazepine-based substance. So the limit, if we're looking for a limit, not that it's really that relevant, then that would be the limit I would take. To answer the second part of the question, what is the negative effect of a benzodiazepine? One of the biggest effects of benzodiazepine is typically an anti-anxiety medication. So it relaxes you and it is designed to prevent you from reacting to a situation that would cause you anxiety in the way that you normally would. If you translate that across into an employee, let's say they are driving a truck and there is the sea of red lights in front of you on the M1 and you want that person to react very quickly to that situation. Because a benzodiazepine nulls the anxiety, it nulls the stress, then actually the reaction that you would get from that employee, exactly the same with a pilot. If an engine goes pop on takeoff, I want them to do some things very, very quickly. Exactly the same with a driver. When the red lights come on in front, I want that behavior quickly. I don't want a more relaxed approach to that because that slows the reactions. So ultimately, it's the level at which they deal with urgency. Then it becomes a slowing of reactions. You also get spatial awareness problems. Similar to alcohol, but the big one is the speed at which you react with urgency.
Okay, thank you. How often should you perform testing, and should every colleague be tested within a certain period?
Again, we see we've got one client that performs 100% testing a year across all staff. That would be very, very expensive, I would suggest. So I'm always going to fall back to, what does the policy say? We've got some clients that ring fence 60% of their staff, and they say they are safety critical staff, and of that 60%, we are going to test 10% of that staff on an annual basis. I don't think there isn't a hard and fast answer. I personally, I'm a big believer in, you should treat all staff the same, regardless of whether they're a cleaner, a driver, a pilot. Ultimately, you are all pulling together in one direction for one mission. And actually, it's about treating everybody with the same rigor and the same level of rules. So I would say you should probably pick a number that works to your budget. What is your allowable budget for testing, and then choose the best quality. And by that I mean oral, whether you use us or not doesn't really matter, but choose the best quality oral fluid testing systems that are out there, rather than if you're using a urine-based testing system, you might as well put that money in the bank every month for when something goes wrong, because the chances are you're not going to find the real problem in your workforce at that point that you're doing the testing.
Excellent. And next question, I'm going to paraphrase a bit because it's quite long. They've done drug testing for years.
Yeah.
How do you get over the challenges of staff challenging the requirement of the test, particularly during a pandemic, saying that they're stressed out, and trying to get out of doing the test? Part A, yeah. And then part B to it is, where would you suggest buying a breathalyzer from?
Buy a breathalyzer from me. No, yeah. So I'll deal with the breathalyzer issue first. Whatever you do, make sure you buy a Home Office approved breathalyzer, or one that is of a Home Office pedigree. So if you're buying it for work, if you're buying it for a business, then ultimately you want to be able to go and defend the rigor within the way that device is managed. So how's it serviced? How's it calibrated? Where's it manufactured? What are the tolerances on the way it behaves and the way it performs? If you go and buy something for 50 quid from Halfords, the chances are the minute you overrange the sensor, and they're quite sensitive sensors, that sensor will never ever come back into where you need it to be, even if you go and try and recalibrate it. That is if the cheaper devices can even be calibrated in the first place. So if anyone wants to talk to me afterwards about the quality of a breathalyzer, there are 3 brands that I would say really you should be looking for. Naturally, we're a partner to Draeger, so I'm going to say the police use Draeger. 85% of UK police forces use Draeger breathalyzers. If you look globally, again, 80% of global police forces are now using Draeger breathalyzers. They really set the standard. They're made in Germany. They're not made from cheaper China sensors, dare I say, that once they've been overexposed to alcohol. So the limit on one of ours is typically 250 micrograms. Again, if you've got 250 micrograms of alcohol in you, you probably don't need testing, because that's such a significant level. So the chances of getting an overrange are quite slim. And then when it does, we can then recover the device. To answer the first part of that question, Paul, sorry, I've lost my track on what the first part was now.
How do you get over the challenges of staff coming up with reasons why they shouldn't be doing the testing?
So the first one is the implementation period, the communication to all that this is, we would say a 4-week amnesty period. So we put some slips in pay packets, so that everybody gets the slip in their pay packet, and then we do a little post that it gets rolled out across the organization that this is coming in 4 weeks time. That doesn't mean that once it's landed, we're going to beat you up with a big stick if you've got a problem. What that means is you've got 4 weeks to come talk to us, get some help, understand what's going on. In that period, then we would roll out some management training. That's then so that the managers can face objections, questions, challenges from the workforce. And ultimately, and dare I say, I always hide behind policy, but I'm going to hide behind policy again. Actually, within your policy, you link your policy to a grievance procedure and you link your policy to the disciplinary procedure. And our paperwork is set up so that they can remove consent at any point throughout the test. And you make it really, really clear that if you remove consent, that may be treated as a disciplinary position. Normally, once you've told a donor that, if they don't have anything to hide, then they're pretty clear on doing it. Sometimes what we find, especially in certain industries where the workforce is more transient, what will happen is they will go along with the test until we found something. The minute we found something, they will withdraw consent because they know then they've just done a test refusal. We won't give the results to the employer, we keep the results. They pack their toolbox or they pack up their knife roll or whatever it is, and then they move on to the next kitchen or the next building site. So we don't see that with pilots. We probably wouldn't see that with drivers because the driving community, I would say, is quite familiar and knows each other. So that's really how we deal with it, is partly through education, is partly through process.
Okay, thank you. And how do you support the company when you're introducing the drug testing program to the staff? I think you've probably covered most of it.
Yeah, again, it's always quite challenging. So normally the policy drafting element can take quite a while because we will ask a lot of questions of the organization. We're going to ask you to make a lot of decisions, and some of them you're not going to be informed on making those decisions and the impact that they have on your organization. So for some clients, we even do the management training before we do the policy drafting, so that then they are informed that when we ask them to make questions, they understand why we're asking them to make the questions, to make the decisions that we're asking them to make. And then again, then something I didn't mention was we also do an employee roadshow. The employee, we quite often will sit and test a senior director or even a COO. It may be done on Teams so that they can have a recorded copy so that staff can log in and see the test taking place, partly to show that there's nothing to fear. I'm a big believer in leading from the front. So if an organization is going to implement this, then actually the management team that's implementing this should have a member sat there and show the workforce how a test is done, whether it's live or whether it's recorded.
Brilliant, thank you. And what are your thoughts on the effectiveness of fingerprint sample testing?
We don't use it. The police don't use it. I would say that how you legitimately go and defend, something when I don't know the statistic, I'm sure someone can Google it, but there is X amount of cocaine found on most banknotes or whatever it is. So if you've got employees handling money, i.e. a bus driver, or even if that has touched a surface, if they've been into a toilet, how you go into court and defend that we took the oils off somebody's fingerprints and found some substances, and that I'd struggle with that one, to be honest. So it's not something we use.
Okay, thank you. And how are the tests and services priced? They work for a small business, so is it realistically affordable?
I mean, we've got small clients where they even have a breathalyzer, and I mean, we can teach you how to do the testing yourselves. And I probably have one. So I didn't mean this to turn into a selling pitch, so apologies everybody. One test for us comes with a test kit. One tube for a mouthpiece. Everything that we do is recorded by barcode. That's so that if we ever end up back in the laboratory, then we can track through the labs. And our testing booklet so under the Human Tissue Act of 2004, we legally have to take consent from the donor before we test their sample of oral fluid. So you don't have to take consent on a breath, you do have to take consent on drugs. So we keep this booklet 6 months once the test has been completed. That's our record of a test of consent being collected for both GDPR and the test. And then the testing form, which is a 2-part copy, accepted by ESSO and CUNARD and a number of other organisations, is your proof that the test has been completed. That for you would be that's a single kit. Typically, I think we sell that for about £42 for one. The problem is the kit, the Draeger equipment does sit on the high side of expensive. So I would say, again, if you're a small organisation, setting a budget to do 5 quality tests is much more important than trying to blanket test the whole workforce, where you're not actually learning anything about the workforce. You're throwing your money. I'm not going to say you're throwing your money away. You're putting a deterrent in place. However, it's a deterrent that's not actually telling you any tangible information. And again, even if you bought, I sometimes see people, some clients ask me, what if I bought 5 good kits and then 20 less good kits or urine kits? How do you then reconcile that if you ever end up in a tribunal that you selected an employee to test with a good kit and yet you chose to test the rest of the workforce with a other kit, shall we say? So again, within the policy, it should be about consistency. Within the behaviours, it should be about consistency, so that everybody knows where everybody stands.
Brilliant. Thanks, David. You'll be relieved to hear that's the end of the questions.
Thank you.
So
hopefully I did all right.
I'll take that opportunity to bring the webinar to a close for today. I hope you all found it informative. I certainly did. So I'd just like to say thank you to David and to everybody in the audience for joining in with us today and asking all the questions. Some really good questions amongst all of that. Next month, I think we're going to rerun this webinar, as we've had so many people that were interested in it. And we'll have a new topic for you in September. Now, at the end of the webinar, you'll automatically receive a feedback survey. And I'd ask that you please spend a couple of minutes giving us your feedback, because we do use your comments to improve future events. So thank you all for your time this morning, and goodbye, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Well,
Thanks, Ed.
could I just add, Paul, that if I'm doing another one next month, if anyone would like a slight twist on the, I'm happy to do a complete rerun. If there's anything that people would like me to go deeper into, I'm more than happy to try and explore some other avenues for you.
Brilliant. Thanks, David. Thanks, everyone.
Not at all. Thank you. Cheers all. Thank you. Bye bye.